Test 1 2 3. Test 1 2 3. Hey, folks, we'll get started here in a few minutes. Thank you for joining us. Okay, we're gonna wait one more minute and then we're gonna get going. I think it's during final season, so the good news is it's posted later. If you guys have questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or Discord. Thanks for coming. I'm gonna do one more quick audio test here. Test one, two, three. Test one, two, three. Okay, looks like we are all set to go. So, welcome to NSD's topic analysis and strategy session for the 2025 Nats tournament. So I have some slides for you. The slides will look a little bit text heavy. I will post a document with all of the cards. I say cards in quotation marks. I thought it'd be nice if you guys went through and highlighted and formatted them the way you wanted, but I think a lot of them could be utilized later on as cards. And I'll post the slides as well so you can reference them. Obviously, there's gonna be a lot that's off the slides, so make sure that you check out the transcript or you check out the video afterwards, which will be posted and live on NSD's channel. If you have questions throughout the time, feel free to put them in the chat. At the end, if you have any questions, I'm happy to give advice on arguments or cases or strategy. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, reach out to me via Discord or email. And hopefully, I look forward to seeing a lot of you in Philadelphia this summer. I'll be there as one of the co-directors of PF at session one and session two. So we're going to have a really great time in Philadelphia. Hopefully, the weather is permitting. Okay, well, let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen and go through some of the topic analysis and strategy. I think this is a lot of it too, which is actually going to spend the first half of this talking about strategy and then going off and talking about the topic specifically. As a coach and a judge, I actually thought it'd be nice to spend a lot of time talking about adaptation at the Nats tournament. And I think that would be as important as understanding the topic because, as some of you know, Section 230 was one of my favorite topics, but it is incredibly legally esoteric, right? And being able to explain legal concepts in small parses during the January, I think circuit or area was a lot easier than maybe doing this as a complicated sort of legal topic when it comes to the Nats tournament. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Great. So let me really quickly just check to make sure that the screen is mirrored, and then we will get going. Like I said, this is a good opportunity just to double check, see if any questions as we go through and get through the topic lecture. So for those that don't know, hopefully it's not a surprise to you what the topic is. It is resolved on balance in the United States, the benefits of presidential executive orders outweigh the harms. Okay, looks like it's being mirrored. That's great. So let's get through it. So there has been a note that intentionally or unintentionally, that national topics sometimes focus on civics quite a lot. On domestic issues too, I think we did some sort of topic data analysis and found that relative to topics during the year, the nationals topic tends to be more domestic oriented, meaning that the actor or the mechanism tends to be more domestic, and the scope of the topic tends to be more domestic. I think it's intentional, unintentional. I know I'm lucky enough to be on the topic committee for the last 2 years, and I do think sometimes there's a conversation that's had about, this being the nationals topic, it's representative of the United States as a whole. and it's a collective conversation, so it should be more oriented towards a sort of civics or domestic sphere. Again, no one ever comes into the conversation when it comes to topic and says we have to have this topic, right? I think when you're ever looking at the topic committee, there's always questions of, what is always relevant, what is timely, what is important, what is debatable, and I think all of those sort of four-way Venn diagram becomes important as we go through, and we'll talk more about that. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about adapting to NATs and evaluative topics. Then I'm going to talk about the executive orders in terms of backgrounds. Then I'm talking a little bit of history under that subsection, history and separation of powers, the law and the courts. I think the law and the courts aspect of it, one part I think especially is going to be undervalued, and I think it should be more valued, especially on the pro, because I think the pro, already I'm going to show my hand here, I think is the harder side to win, despite the counterfactual not being true. What I mean by that is we have executive orders. We've had them since George Washington, and they're still around, right? But the irony is, I think it's harder to defend the pro, despite the fact that executive orders exist. And there's sort of, I'll talk about this later, this gut check, which is if it were either unconstitutionally unsound, if it were from a public policy perspective or a cost benefit analysis so unsound, right, we would have taken actions, maybe hypothetically, to mitigate executive power under executive orders. We would have amended the Constitution. We would have put checks and balances in place. We would have used the legislative and judiciary branch more. I'll kind of talk about, if it is the true, the executive orders are still in, practice and in use even more than usual, right? What does that mean? And maybe the pro, I think, can get an edge here on a couple things. I'll talk about in practice and trends. This is just AKA uniqueness. What does uniqueness mean, though, in an evaluative debate? We'll talk about here in a second. And then lastly, the meat and potatoes, some pro and con strategies. So some of the ideas that I have in terms of where I think you could go with pro and con. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is like adapting to NATs and evaluative topics. I think it's really important to start the conversation here because everything will be filtered through this sort of lens. If this were a topic lecture for any other month, it would be very different because the circuit's going to be different, where you're debating might be different. The difference between the first tournament and the like something like in May or sorry, the February time period, the fourth tournament, oh, like September, like we start debating topics are released what at the end of Nats. Then you have maybe a week before there seems to be an inkling of camps deciding what topics they go for, and different camps will go in different directions sometimes. And then you might have a topic, for example, September for 4 months, right? So that is a topic that requires a lot of legs, a lot of different analysis, maybe different structure. I mean, we say that sometimes, and then the contentions tend to be the same when you start at UK season opener and we go to Bronx, and you're like, wait, how is it the same argument? It's cartels and the immigration from day one to day 60. But regardless, this tournament in a vacuum is very unique, right? It's unique in the sense of it is a single year tournament with a specific type of judging pool and a specific type of participant. And in this case, I think something that people are not realizing, and I hope people put more emphasis on, regardless of the content of the resolution, is the mechanism or type of resolution. So I want to first talk about Nats in general. I was lucky enough to have competed in Nats, and I've probably been to Nats not many comparatively to other coaches, but I've been probably 5 times as either a coach or a judge, which, it's a 100th anniversary, so that is not a lot compared to some other coaches. But I do think that I have noticed some trends and I've noticed and observed some aspects of Nats that I think is important, that I think will change a little bit in terms of how you prepare your strategies in terms of drills and how you continue throughout the competition. The first thing is, you know, it sounds pretty cliche, but nationals is a national championship. What I mean by that is like TOC obviously has 120 teams in gold and silver for those are the tournament champions. Uh, and it does represent a lot of states, and maybe, one, two, three countries if we're lucky. But there seems to be a concentration, right? If you probably count the states between New York, Florida, Texas, Minnesota, California, North Carolina, you would have 40% of the pool in a lot of cases, right? There's a lot of, I think, concentration in terms of certain states, and that can change the way you debate. At Nats, it is at least the goal, right? And I believe, and I have to go back and check, right, that all states have at least one district. I think there are some districts that overlap depending on the state, but you're going to have participants from every state. And I think one thing, and international too, one thing I always note is that, and I've learned this being on topic committees, and I've learned this being on committees in California for speech and debate, is that a lot of schools, you'd be surprised to learn, have a no travel policy, which is if it's especially a public school, it's very difficult, takes a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of resources to travel, and for many reasons, nationals tends to be maybe an exception, or people put the effort and the time and they fundraise for the resources in order to attend nationals. So the type of opponent that you're going to be debating is going to be very different and very varied in a lot of cases. You'll debate people that you've never debated before. You'll see styles that you've never seen before, and I do think you need to be prepared for that because I always have a saying with my debaters that when you debate, it's not debating down because that doesn't mean the styles are bad or different in a bad way. But when you are debating a team and not changing your style, uh, especially in front of a flow or a text slash lay judge or lay judge, you're going to have problems, right? Where you think in your head you're still going to be ahead, it ends up being an issue. I remember watching around at UNLV at the Golden Desert Tournament this year, and I was watching my team against another team, and I already knew the result. I honestly did. I knew the result in the round where on a particular way of interpreting it in terms of flow, in terms of Wang, I knew it was, in my heart, oh yeah, easy. I would vote for them in a second. But then on the other end of the spectrum, I knew immediately that they had lost the round because the other team, in its simplicity, in terms of, we'll talk about adaptation strategies, in terms of the simplicity of the arguments, the simplicity of examples, the repetitive use of a term of an analogy, I knew that the judge was going to buy it. And again, does that mean my team went in there thinking, oh no, we don't need to adapt whatsoever? No, I even think that they didn't. It sometimes it's just the scale adaptation, which we'll talk about. Judging pool. Obviously, I'm going to show you some examples here in a second. The double judging is very interesting. I remember even as a competitor, it's interesting. And I believe I have to double check this. Back in the day, it used to be randomized in terms of the power matching, but I believe that might have changed recently. So um, you do have to get X amount of ballots. I believe it's 8 out of 12, but I'll have to double check that one in terms of how many you have to get in order to break. But the double judging is going to be important because it's not like a triple judge panel where you can't, kick a judge, as we like to say. You have to be able to adapt in ways that I'll talk about here in a second. I always like to mention the judging requirements, which is that oftentimes, in order to meet requirements, oftentimes when they're bringing, especially to nationals, if teams have qualified multiple ones in policy, in LD, in public forum, sometimes they will probably outsource or find former debaters or former coaches or current coaches and former debaters to do policy and LD. Um, there is still this sort of sense in so many places. As someone who's been to locals recently, who's judged at local tournaments recently, who's been back to his home state and seen tournaments, there's really a deep sense that public forum still is an accessible form of an event. And the judging that you're going to get is more lay. And I absolutely, and this is not a bad thing necessarily, but I'm just letting you know, it will be guaranteed to be more lay than any other tournament. And I saw it when I judged last year, 2 years ago, when I was competing, and the last couple of years that I have been. Other thing to keep in mind is sometimes in out rounds is that they prioritize, not always, giving coaches with multiple diamonds access to the judging pool. What this refers to is how many years of experience they have and how many students they've had. I also want to tell folks that, if you have a 5 diamond judge, you still have to take in consideration that, that's something like 25 years of service, if not more, and a lot of time, but that doesn't necessarily equate to a flow judge, right? So you always have to keep that in mind, where even in finals or in semifinals, if they refer to that, you still have to read the paradigm, make sure that you know how you're adapting. Lastly, with evidence, one of the things that surprised some of my debaters in the past and present is that I saw at least 2 rounds in which the opponents did not have computers. Right, they did not use computers in the round. Everything was printed. The NSDA rules are very clear on this, which is that you can use printed materials, of course, but if it's a book, you have to have access to, I believe it's 1 page prior and 1 page before. And if it's an article, I think it's something similar where you have to have majority of the article, but obviously a URL that's accessible, that they can give to you. But just remember, right, it is technically the case that if they give it over to you, maybe you might have to type it up if you want to get access to the full article if you need to. But don't forget that the evidence rules, we assume that the evidence rules are like, I have to have access to for the full PDF. The evidence rules are actually, right, that you have to have the accessible URL, and of the excerpt that you provide, right, you have to provide, this subsection of it. Do you have to have a URL that works if asked for it? Yeah, absolutely. If you have to have a URL that you click it and it opens, for sure. For a book, again, I think the rules are actually a little surprising, but just go through the rules one more time in terms of evidence just to make sure that you're good. And just don't be surprised if your opponents are like, I judged your round last year. And it was literally a school and said, nope, we don't have our evidence accessible. Here's it printed and I'll hand it over to you. So just something to keep in mind if that affects your strategy, just to be aware. I did want to point out in terms of to the pool last year, if you look at the top 25 performing teams, again, for folks going to the tournament, there are some familiar names here, right? And maybe there's some less familiar names. Again, not because one team deserves to be more familiar than the other, but it's something to keep in mind where I would say 10 of the teams I have not judged. And that doesn't mean necessarily anything. I will just say I tend to judge a lot. I've judged over 1,000 debate rounds over the last 10 years in PF. I think I probably have the most in PF ever. So I see a lot of teams, but I think it's important to know that some schools don't have the opportunities that oftentimes we do sometimes on the circuit to get access to tournaments. And you should be prepared to debate teams that are equally as skilled but haven't had as much exposure. That could also mean that their style of debate and the style of which they're engaging the debate could be different. So keep that at the back of your mind as you go through, right? And look at the diversity in terms of states, right? There's still some of that, what I mentioned, the North Carolina, California, Texas, Minnesota bias. But I still think that it's more representative than most tournaments are in terms of West Coast, East Coast. So keep that at the back of your mind. So just making sure that you realize that, and this gets to another point we'll talk about with this topic, is by definition, you know, debate is about ethics and morality and justice and public policy, and you cannot remove the political from that, right? Um, you can't necessarily remove people's biases. And I have a phrase in debate where people say always, it's about being tabula rasa, and I just say, no one is tabula rasa. It is a myth. It is about the extent of intervention, and the best judges are the ones that minimize it in the most expressive and intense ways. And the best judges are trying at every point when intervention arises to minimize it. Oftentimes, that could be technical intervention on behalf of tech and flow judges, which is, are they doing work for you? In terms of lay judges, that might be a little bit different, maybe less technical. It could also be philosophical or intellectual. And we'll talk more about how to deal with that on this topic, but just something to keep in mind is the representative. In terms of judging, I did want to point out, though I did say that the tournament was particularly lay, meaning more community-oriented judges. I went back the last 2 years, and I think I found that last year I only split twice. Again, not saying that maybe I was wrong, the other ballots, but just and not necessarily. Actually, now I think about it, I think every one of my panels was split, meaning I would consider myself more of a tech and a flow judge, and I was probably partnered with someone that was a little bit more flay or lay. And I think every single round that was the case. So just think about that in terms of statistics. And then look, only I would say it looks like here 2 out of the 10 times there was a split. So there's a couple things that could be going on here, right? It could be that the judges are looking at the round similar to me, or it could be that there's some adaptation going on, which we'll talk about here in a second. And if you look at Nats in 2022, same situation. I went back and checked, and it looks like 3 out of the 10 rounds or 12 rounds ended up being a split. And that's about a 33% rate. And I did some comparison to places where you have splits. And I went to, I think, a comparative tournament in terms of lay judges, which is UC Berkeley. It's a little different as you get farther into out rounds because there's a little bit of correlation causation in terms of the judging that's left. But especially in early out rounds, it's actually pretty surprising that, it's a 3-0, 3-0, 3-0, 2-1. I would say the percentage rates are almost very similar. So on one hand, I think it's a little surprising that the splits aren't higher. But two, I actually do think it's because teams are what I say are adapting to the lay or to the flay. Because that rule of thumb, and you probably heard this from your coach or your partner, is that you can debate lay and win both the lay and the tack. But if you debate the tack, you're gonna flip of a coin for the lay, right? So there's no problem if you end up doing adaptation in terms of a lay judge. So in terms of adaptation, right? Going back, we just talked about entry pool, judging pool, rules and norms. Um, if you come to Philly, I'll talk all about this. Adaptation is one of my favorite concepts to talk about because I do think it's this big part of debate, which is that there's a secret part of all of us that wishes that we were telepathic and that when I thought something, it went straight into your head and you understood it 100%. But that's the point of debate, right? Which is that we don't have telepathy. We don't have objectivity necessarily. It's not, people always say it's a game and it's like chess and you should be able to calculate moves. And it might be in some cases moving there, and there might be places where it's easier than others, but you will never be able to remove the inherent subjectivity. So it's again about minimizing intervention. It's about adaptation, adapting or dying. I always joke you'll win 85% of the rounds, but only pick up 70% of the ballots over your career because you have perceived that you have won rounds, and maybe you have won rounds in your perception, but the judges disagree. I remember from the last couple of years, especially the ones we'll talk about here in a second, axioms and analogies, right? Getting a sort of a kernel of an idea, incepting an idea into the judges so that if you ask them after the round, what was the key aspect of your sort of thesis that they're able to get it, right? That's very different than in a technical round where, I just voted you up because you proved that the offshoring of green technology to China ends up having X effects, which outweighs in terms of time frame because I'm able to lower the degrees by 1.5 degrees by 2023, which avoids 100 million deaths, right? That is very different. And I always say that lay and flay judges oftentimes vote on vibes, uh, and tech and flow judges often vote with arguments. What I mean by that is that they'll specify an argument. I voted for this argument, which interacts with this argument because why? Versus it's more rare, but I always try to coach my lay and flay judges to do this is to pick an argument. Oftentimes it's you had better evidence. I thought you were more compelling. I thought the crossfire was stronger, right? Those aren't arguments in the round. Sometimes it's like, oh, I thought the economy point was the strongest. It's not always an explication as to why that's the case. Um, but we'll talk about how to adapt to that here in a second. But axioms and analogies are going to be really important. I always like them to be more specific to the topic. So some of the ones on my team that people know about is don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Don't miss the forest for the trees. A rising tide lifts all boats. But I think something relative or specific to the topic will help you stick in your judge's mind so they can write that on the ballot. The most important thing, and oftentimes you've heard this is judge declarative language. What we mean by that is not judge, 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 right? There's a misconception that is saying the word judge over and over and over again. And I always joke that I have a quota, which is you get three judges per round. Kind of a joke because you have three judges on a panel, but you can say it three times. But beyond that, you should not say it anymore because I think it is a little distracting. But what I do mean by judge declarative language is, especially in the back half in the final speech, it's always joking about like writing their ballot. I don't, again, like going too far and saying you're going to write the words economy is strong on your ballot. But I think it's resolving, explaining the clash in the round because what you're doing is you're showing the interactions between arguments. So it's getting up there and saying, the pro side has spent a lot of time talking about how civil rights has been protected through executive orders, especially against intransigent states that try to resist progress. What we're going to tell you is that that is a pendulum that swings far too often and far too quickly, hurting the same groups that it's in order to protect. We believe a better system that is controlled through a consistent legislature with protections of civil rights for those who need it the most is better for three reasons. And here's why executive orders, in terms of their frequency, the whiplash, in terms of their breadth and uncheckability, are worse for minorities for the X three reasons, right? And that's kind of like the setup of the debate. So then the final focus that you're getting up there and saying something like, we looked at comparative studies and executive orders when it comes to disenfranchised minorities in terms of how they've been affected. We agree that both presidencies, or of the last six presidencies, have had executive orders that have taken away and given more individual liberties to individuals. The question is, as a whole, are individuals better off? And we think that you can do some meta studies that look at something like that. You can talk about our meta study, remember, is much better than theirs because it looks at 1,200 executive orders and makes measurements based on the liberty or free expression index and comes to the conclusion that X, Y, Z, right? If you're lucky to have that evidence. Or you could talk about big picture ideas being like, you're going to vote for us on that evidence, and that's the best evidence in the round from a Yale professor, et cetera, et cetera. That's small picture, right? I remember, funny enough, judging at Yale one year, and I was judging a Durham team. And they kept emphasizing the qualifications of the author, and it works, right? Our evidence from X place came to this conclusion. I don't then like saying things like, "Oh, Don't let the high schooler do economic analysis. Don't let them be junior Supreme Court justice. But I do think focusing the qualifications is going to be good for you. And the big picture being like, oh, talking about the principled reasons as why minorities or disenfranchised groups are either hurt or helped by executive orders, picking three principles, which we'll talk about here in a second, is something you can do. So judge declarative language is like our evidence beats their argument. It is the best piece of evidence around. You should feel comfortable voting for us because it does the analysis and methodology that should make you feel confident knowing that the trend of history is a harm or trend of executive orders is a harm to minority rights versus maybe on the pro saying something like, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice because of tools like executive orders, which help protect minorities in a time where social changes, social states or states that resist might have the power to abuse them, and this is a check against them, right? Something like that. I also think in terms of if you have a split panel, I call this the Haley Mary or the Hail Mary, um, which is debating a little bit more tech, maybe a little bit more flow, going down the line by line, not being fast, of course. But then I always say in the summary, in the final focus, I call this the 30-second vibes RFD. So remember, I told you that I think judges can vote on arguments versus vibes. Um, I think that in this situation with vibes, it's saying, remember the last 30 seconds of the final focus. Our evidence is much better in the round. Our evidence from Yale University does a comprehensive study on court orders against executive orders has concluded the government wins more often than not, meaning that the court is not a good check on executive orders, and the legislature is not a good check on executive orders. Remember, our evidence from Columbia concludes XYZ. At that point, you know that the executive branch is acting outside of the separation of powers, which means it fundamentally violates the core principle of the US government and democracy, something like that. That is a little bit kind of comparatively clash and evidence based, but it's talking about evidence in general, just being like our evidence is better, our rhetoric is better, something that's a little bit more, I think, inclusive. The next thing I want to talk about, I think this kind of surprises people, is that we haven't had an evaluative topic since 2023, first of all. And we haven't had, and only that, it was February, and then we had one topic. So what I mean by that is if you look at topics from the PF topic committee, which I'm part of, so this is an organization that I'm contributing to. What I mean by evaluative topics is that it is not changing the status quo. It is not a policy position or an action that an actor is taking. So evaluative topics are you evaluating the cost benefit analysis of something static and active, right? Or static or active. So it's not that, I should drink more tea. It's that is tea good for Gabe? Does tea do more benefits than harms, right? Fundamentally very different topics. And I know I was talking about this with some folks on the Discord, and there was a discussion about even on the topic committee, this is the big debate, right? I think there are camps that think that evaluative topics are harder for debate and they need to more confusion. And I think those tend to be folks that are more policy and Lincoln Douglas oriented or more policy oriented is the better explanation because they like concrete actions. They like not that gray area, especially in some circuits, can cause some issues, right? Could cause fiat problems. It could cause, obviously, we can have counter plans in PF, but could cause issues with implementation or backlash. And we don't have a lot of evaluative topics now, it seems as a trend. Even if you looked at the pros topics for next year, the ratio seems again very steep in terms of evaluative versus policy topics. So I have to flag to you that this is an evaluative debate, right? You have not, and some of you may have never debated an evaluative debate, maybe since 2023. But also just look at the math here. We had one in February. Then you have to go back an entire, I think I messed it up. I think is that November of 23? Yeah, there's something wrong with the dates here, but um, because that would be November of 22. Yeah, it'd be November of 22, not 23. But November of 22 is the Great Power Competition has been in benefits and harms. March then is the benefits of increasing organic agriculture outweigh the harms. Feb of 22 is on balance. And then you see in 2021, it was just everywhere, right? It was United States, the increased use of regulation. It was NATS, which is social media is beneficial for communicating our values. The benefits of the IMF outweigh the harms. The benefits of the US Space Force outweigh the harms. The benefits of urbanization outweigh the harms. On balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education. I do want to know a couple things. We haven't had a NATS topic that's evaluative in quite a while. And note how 21 and 20 are evaluative, but grounded within a certain matrix or a certain mechanism for weighing, right? So 21 says social media is beneficial for democratic values. So there's an evaluative framework there. And then in 2020, it's for education. This topic does not say, on balance, executive orders do more benefit than harm for democracy. It does not say they do more benefit than harm for justice, right? It does not say they do it for the economy or the environment or for conflict or for the rest of the world. I do think that there are some pros in that because I do think it opens up where if you want to be the team that thinks the environment is the most important topic on this topic and how this gives the president the ability to protect or harm the environment, and then you could do some weighing and framing as to why the environment's the most important part of the topic and intent that could get to some of the impacts that we sometimes go for. I don't know if it's going to work. That I think is a positive of this evaluative topic. But I do want to again note that it has been a very long time since any of you have debated an evaluative topic. We'll talk about that in a second. I do think that what I would do, and I know what some of the debaters that I'm helping and coach do, is they're going to go back and watch NATS 2021, 2020, and even there's a NAFTA topic if you go back even farther that's on YouTube, I know, and watch that round. You need to go watch those evaluative rounds. I think that's my number one recommendation in terms of what to do, to see the cadence, to see how they're framing the arguments, to see how they're structuring their cases, because you'll be very surprised in terms of probably what you see. And I think that the most relevant one's probably 21 because it is democracy is kind of some of the aspects of what we're getting to, and there's a specific mechanism here, which is social media, and I'm going to talk about that specific topic here in a second. But I think it's really important that you go back to your previous evaluative topics and cases and see what you were doing differently. So just real quickly talk about, I went back and watched the Nats finals topic for the social media topic. Look at their cases, right? If I were to show you like a Section 230 case and if you debate on the circuit from 20, what would it be, last year from 2024 in January, I would be very surprised if any of your contentions sounded like this, right? Contention one is strengthening democratic processes. Subpoint A, trust in government. Subpoint B, direct participation in democracy. Contention two is giving a voice to the people. Subpoint A is platform expression, excuse me, strengthening activism. Contention one is disproportionate power. Subpoint A, inequality. Subpoint B, monopoly. Subpoint C, too big to fail. Contention two is information skew. Echo chambers, foreign interference, right? I think the biggest thing that I want to flag here, and this is what we're going to get through when we talk about this entire topic, is that when people do evaluative topics, they make a mistake, I think, especially in front of lay or flay judges, and think it's a list debate where it's you list five good executive orders and they list five bad executive orders, and you just say which one has had more of an impact and why is that bad or good. You could do that. You could just be the team that focuses on one executive order that you think basically has poisoned the pill, poisoned the barrel, I should say, and is the most important reason why executive orders have done more benefit than harm. You could, right? I just think that that puts you in a difficult position of defending or objecting to one executive order. I also think that you will have a hard time winning the evaluative side of the debate, which we'll talk about here in a second, as a whole, which is look at the way in which they structure their cases, which is that they are bigger themes, and even the subpoints are not, they are very specific. Note, not a single mention of a single political party. And if you go back and you go back and watch the rounds, I think that's going to be impossible on this topic. I think not to talk about political parties, but obviously politicians. I think it'll be impossible because literally the action itself is going to be from these presidents that we're going to have to talk about. But I do think that if you know that if you read this, you would have technically no, hopefully partisan bias on any of these aspects, right? Trust in government, participation in democracy, platforming of expression, strengthening activism, inequality, monopolies, too big to fail, echo chambers, foreign interference. Literally every judge should be able to agree with those principles. So I think you have to like go through as you start to make your cases and think about that. And I've created some pro and con that I think are very similar to this that I'm going to show you guys here at the very end. But I think those are some of the principles that you have to think about. Because if you ask the judge after finals, oh yeah, I agree with you. Social media creates disproportionate power through inequality. Or, oh, direct participation in government or democracy went up because of social media. Yeah, I get that. Now, if you go through, especially the cases that they read, it's a lot of meta evidence. What I mean by that, no pun intended in so many ways, is that it's a lot of comprehensive studies. And I think that's going to be important, but it's going to be a little tougher on this topic, and I'll talk about that in a second. But being able to be like, look at, there's 14,000 executive orders. It's going to be really tough to make conclusions. But there are studies that do some direct analysis. There's studies that say X executive order had this effect. I literally have an example for you guys of where a study was like literally X effect, this was the effect of it, this is what happened, etc. So there is the evidence out there, and we'll show you some examples of the collective and holistic evidence. So I think start looking for meta studies so that you can get up there as a strategy, being like, they get up here and isolate you the uh Trump Muslim ban, right? Um, but they, again, don't let imperfection be the enemy of the good. If you look at the 14,000, executive order history, here's how the tool has been used holistically and collectively, and here's how we think it can still be used for good or bad. Not to say again, you always have to resist making sort of, I think, policy and political evaluations of executive orders whenever you can, but you're gonna have to bite the bullet. And one of the things we'll talk about later on is that I think every side on the pro and con should have a list of 10 executive orders that they've memorized, not like the text themselves, but what they do on both sides. And I think half of them have to be Republican and half of them be Democratic. Find five really good that you think are Republican and five Democratic executive orders that you think are really good, have done really good things, and on the con side. Not necessarily because that's going to be your case, but just be like, here are examples in terms of scope and benefits of what's going to end up happening. Because what these teams didn't end up doing is they didn't like say, here are five ways in which social media has destroyed everything, like the terrorism attacks in Sri Lanka, January 6th, deep fakes, like all of this stuff. You could like those aren't their contentions, right? C1 isn't terrorism, right? One of their argument ended up being extremism underneath one of those. But notice how general sort of their arguments are. I do think like then this begs the question about evaluative topics. How do you win evaluative topics? Because their critique of evaluative topics are how do you do weighing, right? Because when we're doing weighing, we do policy topics. It is like the action that we're about to take is going to have an advantage and a disadvantage. And I'm going to either disprove the advantages or disadvantages happen, or I'm going to concede that they both happen, but now I'm going to tell you, is it worth it, right? I still think that you're technically doing that on a topic like this. And I think that it's given a bad rap in terms of out of topics to say, oh, it's so hard to evaluate whether, X impact has happened. Technically speaking, of out of topics, the impacts are more clear. As in 90% of the debate is going to be talking about what has probably already occurred versus the other topic, it's 20% of the debate about what has already occurred and what may occur, right? What I mean by that is that, we've had time to process the effects of an executive order. We've had time in some cases, obviously not with Trump 2, but with Trump 1, with Biden, with Obama, with George Bush, with Clinton, with Reagan, with Carter, right? We've had the ability to look at the effects of executive orders. So you have an ability in many ways to start making that cost benefit analysis, what I think is pretty cool, with better evidence, right? Because we can speculate all the time about what would happen if we joined the International Criminal Court or if we invested in nuclear energy, right? But there are so many variables outside of our control, we're not sure. But what we are and be able to minimize in terms of variables is what's happened in the past. I do think that this gets to a couple problems, and you'll notice this if you go back and watch the NAFTA finals, which is the counterfactual, right? What would the world look like without executive orders? And two, how much of the past and the present and the future can you look at? What I mean by that is if the topic is unbalanced, executive orders have more benefits than harms, right? What is the grammatical phrasing imply? What I mean by that is if a tool has changed over time in terms of how it's constructed or how it's used or how it's abused, right? But it was really good in the past, but now in the present it's being abused. How much of the past can beat the present and the future? And I think if you were to like, I always say like cars are a good example of this, where I think it's flip back and forth all the time, where in the past they were very dangerous, one of the highest levels of mortality rates. And they really, especially early on in the first 20 years, were not that critical for commerce, right? They were really much for privilege and those the wealthy. Everything was still being done via train. And then you started to have it shift, right? Where it became more accessible, safety standards started increasing. Trucks became the major use of means of transportation, boats and trains still important, but then that shifted. And then there was shift again, where because of CO2 emissions, because of faster cars, because of bigger cars like SUVs, you have pedestrian deaths higher than ever before. But then we see the shift again, where now we're shifting to EVs and we're shifting to autonomous vehicles, where that means mitigation of deaths and also mitigation of climate change. So it's a really hard debate to be like, on balance, do motor vehicles do more good than harm, right? And the question is, do you go back to literally Henry Ford? And you being like, well, in 1924, in 1937, in 1944, here are the mortality rates, and 100,000 people died, and even if now they're going down, 1944 outweighs 2010. I think you do have to defend all past, present, and future, in my opinion, right? I think because if you were to get up there and just say the only thing that matters right now is the present, I think that ignores the fact that the past proves that the future can change, right? Which is that the use and frequency can change in terms of executive orders in the future being used in ways that people agree with or used in ways that are more, I think, within the principles of democracy. I think you have to be like, look, 14,000 executive orders have been issued. They might disagree with 500 of them. That does not discount the other 1,305,000, right? They uphold three principles of X that are still really important. Remember what I said, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Let the pendulum swing sometimes. Sometimes the pendulum does swing. Does not mean you remove the pendulum just because it has the ability to be abused at times. I think it gets into any debate about any tool. It's the social media one too, right? Which is its initiation of social media, how it was used. Then how was it used when bots and ethnic tension and democracy and capitalism got involved? How does it change over time? So I think you have to take a step back and you can't get up there and just say, oh, no, 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 it's only its current use. And you can't say it's about its future use. And you can't just say it's about its present. I think that the burden of both sides is to defend the past, present, and the future, which I think is problematic and in argumentative ways, which is why people don't like evaluative topics. You can't always predict what's going to happen in the future. But the irony here is that's what we always do in public policy topics when it's a should topic, is that we predict what's happening in the future. So what does this mean for you? I think that means you have to know more about the past than you probably thought you did. Obviously, Biden, Obama, George Bush, and Trump is where you should spend the most of your time. Um, Obviously, Biden and Trump being the most recent is probably where, and Obama, and I know, I think those four and Bush are the ones you should probably know the most. But I think you're never going to go up there and say Carter and Reagan disprove or approve of what you're doing. Um, but I do think it's important to always be like, if 50, 100 years of this tool was used in a good way, does that mean 5 years of abuse of it could it totally compromise it? Maybe. And that's the next kind of ground to be like, we think that it's now the Pandora's box is open. We think that there's some checks that have been removed. We think you can't put them back. And now in perpetuity, this tool has changed fundamentally. Versus the other side, I think the pro can say this tool, it can be used for good and bad, and the potential for the good is more important and it will be more important in the future for the reasons we're talking about. So just food for thought. And the most important thing to take away is go back, watch Nat's NAFTA, Nat's social media, Nat's charter schools to see how these teams sort of create a evaluative topics and avoid the list problem. Okay. So wait, we're already for 45 minutes and haven't talked about the topic. That's so good. That's classic. Okay. Wow. Well, hopefully you guys can, turn up the speed. We'll get through. We'll get through. Okay, so executive background, history, and separation of powers. So let's talk about the topic because that's probably why you're actually here. Hopefully, some of that other information was useful to you. So you'll notice there's going to be a lot of text. I'm not going to be reading from it, obviously, in every situation or most of it. But I do think it's important to go through some technical aspects of the topic first before we go into sort of the big picture when it comes to arguments. Um, I always one of the tricks I have when I have motivators do research is to always look at the most cited study or the most cited sort of paper on a topic. And the most cited one that I could find in political science and even the law, to my knowledge, is this Mayer paper. And I'll send out the links later. This JSTOR link actually is publicly accessible, so it's not behind a paywall. This one is more of a public policy or political science paper. It's not a legal paper per se. It's going into actually looking into how Congress and the executive orders interact with each other. But I did like a couple of his definitions, and I'll talk more about those, which is an executive order is a presidential directive that requires or authorizes some action within the executive branch. Presidents have used orders to establish policy, reorganize branches or agencies, alter administrative and regulatory processes, affect how legislation is interpreted and implemented, and take whatever action is permitted within the boundaries of the constitutional statutory authority. So let's break it down, right? I kind of broke it down into two things: legislate gaps and help with interpretations of legislation. What does that mean? I guess the third one is that reorganization one, which is if you read about the history of the separation, sorry, the history of executive orders, a lot of it actually is about personnel at the beginning, is getting personnel done, getting people in places, getting organizations set up, et cetera. We'll talk about in a second. But the ones that will probably be as relevant or more relevant to what we're talking about today is legislating gaps, meaning there are apparently areas or gaps that the executive think exists. And then second, interpretations of legislation. And this one is the one that I think people don't think about as much. And this will become important when we talk about the courts in a second. We talk about Chevron deference in administrative agencies. But it's a little surprising that people don't focus on this one because it can have equal, if not as much effect, which is how you interpret existing legislation, which is the president will literally say, we have this existing law. We have the Affordable Care Act. We have the National Security, we have the Patriot Act. We have the National Security Act of the 80s, right? And the president will be like, this is how to interpret a law that Congress passed. So that again could be pro or con, and I'll explain why later on, but it's something where separation of powers might be kind of surprising. Um, Later on in terms of the action. I think most people would understand or probably recognize the establishing policy aspect of executive orders, which is those are the ones that come to mind first, probably less the interpretations or reorganizations. So this is a lot of text, but I think if you go back and I think you should read another paper. If I had to say, there's another paper that you should read. It's David Driesen's paper. He does come out on the side against executive orders. Um, and he looks at both Obama and Trump in particular. So he's looking at both of them to make these sort of conclusions. But I do think his argument is a little bit more principled. And if you go through here, and in the paper, there's a link to it. I'll add it on, which is also publicly accessible. He really talks about the separation of powers. And I know this sounds like a push or AP government, and that's something like, wow, I just want to talk about, how quickly nuclear winter can take over the world. I do think it's really important that you get your separation of powers understanding down because, especially on the pro side, you're going to have to be dealing with this issue, which is that the pro has this bias of current bias or recency bias, which is that people that didn't like Biden or didn't like Trump are going to think those executive orders are bad. Executive orders are bad. But two, it really does when you say legislate gaps. That is the verb legislate. That is not the branch of government that does legislation. Like that's the legislature, and I'm talking about the president doing policy and legislation. That sounds like the opposite of what the president is supposed to do. And I think Dresden goes into this argument where he says, look at the way in which Congress and the presidency and the courts are set up, right? Which is the U.S. Constitution establishes a point of legislative supremacy. It gave them the power to enact a broad set of laws and control the budget, to regulate interstate commerce, spend money to promote general welfare, declare war, raise armies, and create the rules that govern immigration and naturalization. The president does have a veto, right? But the Constitution envisions policy decisions legislatively enacted through statutes, right? The president cannot write a statute. I mean, technically speaking, he can write a statute, but he cannot pass the statute, right? A statute is a law, right? The Constitution requires the president to take care of oaths. He talks about all the oaths that they have to take and all have the ideas of upholding the Constitution and has to execute the law. But what basically, Drayson comes down to is like Congress declares the wars, controls the purse, writes the laws, and an effective uh, actor or and someone who affects what's the word who is an implement who focuses on implementation of those acts is the president. So I think it's really interesting to think about it like Congress has all these actions, which is purse or legislation, and then the president is there to be like, how do I execute those for you? Right? How do I make sure that the agencies get the budget that you're talking about? And how do I make sure when you declare war that the government, that the Department of Defense is being successful in that? How do I make sure when you have legislation that it is effectively administered? So it's pretty interesting. And I think that you'll see a lot of themes in these debates to see that this is flipped, right? Because Trump too has had in terms of let's talk about all three, right? In terms of budget, right? We've had issues in terms of I think they've used the words like, I don't know, budgetary control, as in like stopping the payments literally going from agencies or going to aid organizations, right? They've uh, basically gone with the U.S. Treasury and being able to impound some of these funds. So that some people have argued that's taken away the power of the purse, right? In terms of war, right? Because of AUMF, which predates Trump in terms of the authorization of military force, this happened to Obama, George Bush, et cetera, right? The president can sometimes engage in certain limited conflicts based on if it's connected to terrorism, so maybe doesn't need war powers from Congress anymore. Tariffs, technically speaking, unless it's national security, are supposed to be under the presidency, right? And even Biden continued those tariffs, right? So this is not just a Trump thing. And then lastly, obviously, when it comes to legislation, Congress is supposed to pass legislation, not the president, in order to create legislation. If you do some reading, there's this sort of interesting argument that ends up happening, which is there's this sort of miming or mirroring effect where now when presidents do executive orders, their corresponding party then passes a piece of legislation afterwards to correspond with it. And because the president has already taken the political, what's it called, capital in order to do the action, Congress then passing that same basically thing into law takes little or no effort and doesn't harm them. Pretty interesting concept. That there's a couple papers that talk about this happening. So I think the first thing is like there's a separation of powers, and both Democrats and Republicans, and most importantly, the Supreme Court has allowed for a more unitary, powerful executive branch, where the separation of powers starts to look a little bit different. And to his credit, you know, Dresden says like, look, George Washington realized this. George Washington implemented an executive order, right? Himself, so he was not immune to this. But you already start to see in the 19th century, as Dresden points out, where political reality started to meet practicalities. And I think this is where the pro starts to get a little bit more ground, which is there was an argument for separation of powers, which is in a perfect world, the legislative branch is the purse, the declarer of war, and creates legislation. The courts check all of that legislation to usually make sure that it corresponds with the Constitution, and then as the courts obviously create its own law over time to make sure it corresponds with other law uh, as we go through, right? And then you get to uh, a point in the 19th century where even on that shit, even early on in the Republic, where political parties start to happen, where practicalities start to happen, where economies start to happen, technology, which starts to make things in terms of separation of powers have issues, right? So what Dresden talks a lot about, and I think his article, which is really interesting, is that you begin to lose this sort of utopian vision of all these elements aligning at the right time, allowing for the perfect separation of powers and the perfect function of government where practicalities start to come into place. And what we began to realize, right, is that the president needed more power in order to have an effective government, right? Which is there weren't agencies to do a lot of the legislation that we're talking about, but maybe those agencies weren't explicitly in the Constitution, right? There were specific departments or cabinet secretaries that we talk about now that did not exist 150, 250 years ago. So, and those are really important because people forget the Department of Homeland Security did not exist until 2001 or after 9/11, right? But it's not in the Constitution. So where does that come about? So you start to see that the pro side of the argument is about flexibility, it's about emergencies, it's about urgency, which is you have to sometimes have a flexible presidency in order to deal with exigent circumstances. Like think about, I think like again, creating national security apparatuses or national security after 9/11, after terrorism starts to increase, after, movements are happening, right? uh, People would say that you have to push it through Congress. There has to be a bill, and there were bills that happened. There were lots of bills that needed to get passed, and the Patriot Act, etc. But there's sometimes questions of flexibility, of timing, of what can be done in a certain X amount of time. And I think there is an urgency requirement that's going to be made. The problem with that is the minute you start saying this, there's a really good executive order that someone's going to bring up that I think is a great counterexample, which is the Japanese internment camps, right? Which is the Japanese internment camps were an executive order, which we'll talk about in a second. But I do think that's the debate that has to be had, right? Which is you do have one of the worst, moments in U.S. history as an example of an executive order for emergencies, urgency, flexibility, right? And then you're like, oh wait, that was what justified the internment camps. That's what justified, the Muslim ban, or the so-called Muslim ban, using the rhetoric, sorry, of Rudy Giuliani there. Um, so I do think that ends up being a question that we move forward. But I think you do have to start seeing like the con side's going to be like separation of powers or violating this principle. But like, no, over the last 200 years, there has been this sort of understanding that the modern economy, modern states with over 350 million Americans, not 10 million Americans, right, requires a level of flexibility. And that's kind of a pro side of the argument. So I think the funny example is this article from Deering that talks about the president declaring neutrality in a war between France and England, right? Why couldn't he do that via Congress? Why wasn't he, why weren't treaty powers afforded to Congress? But again, what's happening now, you could say with the Israel-Palestine crisis or Iran, in terms of, the presidency in Biden or Trump or Obama's era, being able to enact foreign policy consistently requires flexibility. And that goes back to someone like George Washington. But we read through the examples go through Lincoln, right? All of what Lincoln was able to do. I do think it's probably pretty cool that you could use Lincoln as an example of how executive orders helped probably in the Civil War. But then again, you talk about what happened after the Civil War, and the Reconstruction was not great, not great. Jim Crow, pretty horrific. So again, it goes back and forth in terms of the debate in terms of history. But I do think, like again, if I were a team at Nats, I'd memorize some good ones on the pro side from George Washington, from Lincoln, from FDR. Obviously, those are cross political. So Lincoln was Republican, FDR was Democrat. George Washington, doesn't ascribe to our modern political sense in terms of parties. But if I think memorizing those would be a kind of cool way to kind of explain to judges, I think in terms of time and history, how things are looking. Um, I did bring up some pre-1995 examples, and the reason I did those is because that's from Mayer's article. Um, the Executive Office of the President, again, talk about implementation, practicality. Like, in order to have a functioning federal government, you needed to have executive orders in order to get literally a personnel, to get folks to do the work of the federal executive branch. The executive branch cannot do its work, or could not do its work without the executive orders. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you obviously have FDR's internment. Integration, one of the biggest pro arguments I'll be talking about later on is fighting civil rights battles that are entrenched or protected by federalism. Integration of the armed forces. Funny enough, Clinton ended up backing down, but Clinton was going to establish defense of LGBTQ and queer I guess not T at the time, but lesbian, gay, and bisexual men in the army in the 90s, but ended up backing down because of political backlash. But the mechanism he was going to use was actually going to be an executive order, right? And we'll talk about that when we get to the pro side. But what about the Peace Corps, right? Remember I talked about agencies. Carter ended up using an executive order to get the hostage deal eventually upheld by the Supreme Court, which I'll talk about here in a second with the courts. But I think we're like memorizing at least one executive order from each decade might not be a bad idea in terms of being able to explain the course of history. I think the neg side, especially, if you get up there and talk about, I think the neg argument things will be about populism and nationalism, talking about internment, the travel bans, and how like presidents can use these tools in populist moments in ways that are really negative. If memorizing those, I think everyone at this point disagrees with the internment camps, I hope, of Japanese Americans. Okay. Um, I do think there's a legal question here, which is could you talk about the legality of executive orders? This kind of gets into one of my pet peeves in debate when anyone ever talks about something being unconstitutional, constitutional, so we should or should not do something, or something is constitutional, unconstitutional, so it's bad. Uh, First of all, let's get out of the way. Executive orders under Supreme Court precedent, under Article 2 of their interpretation of Article 2 are constitutional. Done. Moving forward. Like no reason to get up there to say that executive orders as an action as a whole are executive orders in practice, are some unconstitutional? Sure. It's equivalent to like saying, can Congress legislate at this point? Yes. No one's saying that's unconstitutional. At this point, don't even like, I wouldn't even go into sort of the theory or the debates about EOs in general, but about how they're used in practice. Are some laws that are passed then later to be found unconstitutional? Yeah, of course. And that's kind of like EOs. And this will be important for the pro side when I talk about it in a second. But I really like Erica Newland's article on this. I think it's a really good study on the review of executive orders by courts. But I think in particular, she talks through the sort of the legal backing of it under the sort of what's delegated to the president and what's not, and in that gray area, what's allowed to him under or her under Article 2. So she goes through it and explains it. But I do think that this is important. And her article goes into 150 cases that the courts have gone through in terms of reviewing executive orders. And she hasn't come to the conclusion there's only been 150 cases. So let's say you have 14,000 executive orders. Her conclusion isn't there's only been 150 cases. It's hard to code, basically, what she says, figuring out exactly which case is exactly about an executive order's legitimacy or constitutionality. But she comes to the conclusion that she can probably can confidently say there's at least been 150 cases talking about the executive order from a president. But this is important, which is what did I just tell you about separation of powers, right? The courts can review executive orders. So I think that the pro side has to have this sort of overarching narrative at some point, especially when it's doing its sort of front lines in defense. Um, One second. It's doing its defense of the argument. 1 second. Making sure my audio's still working. Sorry. Audio's still working. I just someone's asking in the chat. What was I saying? Yeah, so I think one of the most important things to realize is that the courts are a check, which is I think the pro can get up there and be like every executive order is reviewable, and 150 of them have been at least reviewed, not maybe even more under appellate and circuit court and appellate circuit courts and district courts. But I think this idea that the president can enact with his pen and exist in his own little land in his own little area without review. Is not true, right? So it's important to remember that if you're on the pro side, that courts are still a vehicle that can still check the president's power. Now, the question is, what happens in practice, right? So she goes through and says, and I think it's important to do like the comparative rates because for people that don't know, the government usually has a really good record in front of federal courts. What I mean by that is like, do they end up losing or winning? And I think she finds, and I think this is true in Supreme Court cases too, which is generally speaking, the government has a 65% win rate for cases, which you might seem sounds like high, but in terms of resources, in terms of usually what the government, uh, 1 second, one more audio issue. In terms of the government resources, there's something called the Office of the Solicitor General, and there's sometimes obviously in terms of the Department of Justice obviously has an amount of lawyers and resources and concentration of expertise that other people don't have. So, for example, there are lawyers in the civil division and the criminal division of the DOJ that have been there for 10, 20 years, right? So that might be a reason why the percentage is higher. But she does say that when it comes to executive orders, oftentimes they end up having, I think she says an 83% federal win rate when they've been challenged in court and come up to the level of the appellate and the Supreme Court, which means people say, oh, that means that they're approving them 83% of the time. It does seem pretty high because those are the only ones that are challenged apparently in there. That means 13% of the 150 cases, I guess is the math there, 10 or 15 seems kind of low. That's debater math, so make sure you check exactly how many have been kind of overruled. But it does seem like there's a limited amount of executive orders that end up being challenged. And overturned. So, in many ways, you could say on one hand that this is an example of the system working. On another hand, you could say, what would I say? You could say on one hand it's the system working. On another, you could say that the courts, because the rubber stamping, mean that it's not a good check. So I think it's a debatable side of it. I guess my inclination is to say that this is over obviously a lot of period of time, over judges and justices appointed from different political persuasions, even though the Supreme Court has been held by Republicans since 1967. Um, I still think it's important to be like, hey, on the pro, there's court review that could help with dealing with what we think is an unchecked too much of a tool or a pen. And I think that's something when you're reading through Erica's article that is important to go through. So the point of the law and the court review here is the law establishes what the president can do. There are sort of limitations, and if you read through Erica's article, it does talk about some of the principles in terms of when the court has held that the executive branch has gone too far. Funny enough, she quotes, I think maybe at the bottom of this article about a judge who thought it should be expanded, and that judge at the time was Judge Kavanaugh. If that name sounds familiar, is because Judge Kavanaugh was part of the DC Circuit at the time and is now a member of the Supreme Court. So that's pretty interesting that you could make an argument on the con side that not only in terms of frequency of use, but the expanse of the use of executive orders are probably going to be changed over time. If there's any test cases that are going to come up during Trump 2, you could argue this is a much more friendly court to the expansion of executive power. And this is probably true of the last 20 years of the Roberts Court, which is they've been really friendly to the executive branch. So a con argument, the trends in use, the courts may be less of a check and gives more executive power. And this is kind of a visual representation of when um, cases have been approved or disapproved. So, or executive action. So in this case, like for example, 10% of contracts or presidential powers have been limited or have been contracted, maybe in review. 12%, 13%, which is pretty low. But still, it kind of shows there is a purpose. Okay, so a couple background in terms of practice and trends. So we got the law down. We've got a little bit of what it's able to do. One thing we didn't talk about actually before we move on is that sort of legislative intent. I'll show you some examples here in a second, which is some people forget that when we pass a piece of legislation, it has like a clause in it that says, every citizen should get a Boston Terrier and a cup of tea, right? That's not intuitive necessarily in terms of what everything is. Boston Terrier, how old? When do they get the Boston Terrier? By the way, I want a Boston Terrier and I love tea, so this is why it's the example. But for tea, a cup of tea, what is the average size of a cup, right? So then you have to have this conversation, which is if they don't put definitions in the bill, if they don't give you specific terms, if they don't give you a mechanism, like who interprets it? There was a big Supreme Court case last 2 years or last year about something called Chevron deference. Chevron deference had been the law of the land for decades and referred to a case involving Chevron, you probably know it, the company. And the result of the case was basically talking about when there is a disagreement about what a law or an action, when it comes to a law, how it's being implemented, right? We should defer to agencies in terms of the nuances in the gray area because they probably have more expertise in that sort of interpretation and they should probably be more trusted. So if they're debating about how to give out the cup of tea or debating about how to give the Boston Terrier to people when, and how, and there's no agreement on it, we should probably defer to them, which is called Chevron deference, in terms of doing it. So, for example, I don't know if it was implementing COVID mandates, if it was implementing EPA regulations when it comes to what becomes like a toxic gas, we would defer to them in terms of their expertise in cases where it was reasonable to do so. And there was actually a lot more standards than people remember about, when the agency would have the ability to trump other people. But basically, the court said, well, no, never mind. We're going to pull back a lot of that power, and now, and some people think it's actually going to cause court packing, not court packing, court backlog or gridlock, court clog, as you guys like to say, is that now there's going to be a lot of cases about interpretations, especially within agencies, about what laws mean and how to implement them. And they put a lot of the power into the court system now to interpret those, which means a lot of judges will be doing a lot of work. That could also be part of this topic, which is, as Chevron deference ended up going away and things shift, how does that affect the topic moving forward? Okay. So pre-1995, for the 20th century, what executive orders look like? They look really high, right? The number of orders issued per month. We'll talk about what that compares to under the last two administrations. I will say, and our evidence is pretty good at saying this, the reason that they were so high that so long ago was because of the personnel issues I was talking about. So a lot of these orders could have been literally an order establishing someone in an appointment that's not Senate approved. So again, can you go back there and say, oh yeah, the modern day bureaucracy only exists because they gave orders? Yeah, sure. That's the flexibility I was talking about, and maybe the future of the flexibility. Post Doge, I really do think there's an argument to be made that if a Democrat or a Republican that wants a bigger federal government comes into power after the Trump 2, they are going to have to very quickly be able to create some of these positions that have been eliminated. And I think a restoration of the federal government on the scale we're talking about is only available through executive order. I think this is what we're going to talk about when we talk about the pro side, which is the executive orders allow for transitions between presidents, which is like if the Democrat or a different type of Republican gets elected in 2028 and they want to change course, this allows them to do so and doesn't make them wait a year or 2 years in order to do so. And that's important because that's representative of a democratic will, right? So I think that's going to be an interesting argument. So if you look at the last 10 presidents, maybe even more, I think it's 15, there's a website that tracks them total orders, average years and years in office, and then range. Let's go back to Kennedy, right? I think sometimes people are surprised. There's always this conception, that Trump and Trump one had the most executive orders, or he's the most prolific executive order president ever. Not true. At least for Trump one, he is now on track, obviously, to outpace maybe Clinton, as well as any other former presidents. We'll talk about that in a second. But it is important to note, right, that Obama has had currently is the current modern record of a Democrat. That is after Clinton, and then Bush obviously has the most for our most recent Republican president. But if you go back to Nixon, right, Nixon had 346, Reagan had 381. So the idea that the frequency is increasing over time is only true for right now. Literally just as Trump too. So the question is again, does that mean that if the pendulum swings, does it go away one or the other? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You can argue it either way, but I do think it's important when they get up there and say, it's going out of control. Like the trajectory means that we can never unpack it. No, like Bush had 166, Clinton had 64, and then Biden had 162. So this idea that, the even between same parties, that this means the next party will do even more, which is untrue, factually speaking. So there are changes over time. Again, is there a correlation between partisanship and executive orders? Some of the studies will look into that a little bit. That being said, Trump too is disproportionate, right? If you look at his first term, right, at this point, he had issued at his 25 days in office, by the way. This is just 25. This is missing the other 154. So if you do the math, 154 is gonna be like up here, right? So up here around here. So if you look at it, it's quite a lot. That's three times as much as the most recent president and Truman, and three times as much as Biden. So it does look like over time, presidents are doing more and more and more. The part that's interesting here is that when you have parties that are different than you in the legislative branch. So oftentimes the original argument was that you would implement executive orders when a party disagrees with you or is in control of the Congress. But even Mayor Study in 99 tends to disprove that and says that executive orders are no longer correlated with party control. So the idea that it's just to respond to gridlock might not be true. And I think that's a pretty good con argument as a block. In terms of April 16th, which is about a month and a week ago, um, what are some of the themes? Obviously, bureaucracy, foreign policy, immigration, natural resources. People forget, and I think tariffs, if you want to go from an economy perspective, a lot of the tariffs, there's some debate about it, but a lot of the tariffs can be attributed to executive orders. Remember what I told you? Technically, and this is something that always surprises people, tariffs cannot be implemented unilaterally by the president unless they have national security justifications. So if you remember the Canadian tariffs, all that discussion about fentanyl, the reason the administration had to defend it under fentanyl was because they had to give a national security justification. Now, you could say, and they would say, no, that is their main justification. But then sometimes you'll hear the rhetoric disagree and talk about unfair economic practices, which is maybe your fine justification for tariffs, but that is not a national security justification. You could argue that global tariffs and executive orders now allow for a singular president to control an economy. I think that could be a cool con argument, talking about how the economy can be controlled by one person, which sounds bad in some situations and could be considered bad in this situation too. Same with immigration, right? Foreign policy. That kind of gets to some of the stuff we'll talk about later on. But if you want to talk about like something that's current, I will say I also think that tariffs are pretty bipartisan in terms of their people against them at the moment. If you look at polling, I think even it was as high as 70% and as low as maybe 55% in terms of opposition. But that is majority opposition to tariffs. So if you want to feel like there's a good reason to vote for the con, you could talk about how Congress should have power to just control tariffs. You should be like small businesses should not be dictated on the whims of Biden or Trump, and it should be under the auspices of all representatives so that your local representative from the state of Colorado can decide whether or not there should be a tariff on goods that affect them, not just one individual, right? So I think tariffs could be a cool argument on the con side in terms of, again, I wouldn't be contention one tariffs. It would be something like separation of powers and then maybe a sub point being the economy, something like that. For previous, there's some good Biden studies here too on how some of his executive orders were also unpopular. But generally speaking, executive orders are surprisingly sometimes not as popular as people think. I think the wall one, the polling ended up changing where it actually had a majority approval at some point. But going back and looking at them, I think is pretty interesting. Okay. So what does this get us to? So I think it gets us into like this idea of it's an evaluative topic that has to think big picture. You can't just do lists of like here's a Reagan, George Bush, Biden, Obama executive order that are good. All the Trump and Carter ones are bad. You should vote for the pro, right? No. We're beyond that. So we have to think of big principles. So I guess if I were to write three contention titles, it'd be something like, mitigating gridlock, protecting social change and state abuse, or elections or democracy representation, something like that. I think it's kind of similar to the arguments or the style of arguments that I was talking about the social media topic. And I'm gonna look at only a couple of them here, but I think what the idea would be behind them all, right, is that find principles that people agree with as being universally bad. So gridlock is a great example, which is, the amount of pieces of legislation passed in the last Congress are the lowest that it's ever been. The amount of the federal deficit is increasing. The amount of bipartisan votes is decreasing. Congress has ceded its ability to be an effective legislator. This could be really, really bad. And you can talk about national emergencies. So talk about under mitigating gridlock, talk about national security, right? Talk about wars, talk about the COVID pandemic and how it'd be really hard. Imagine, how do I say this? Imagine the COVID pandemic happening now, right? There's a new strain that's happening where obviously there's now more, I think, partisan lines in terms of responses than there were before in terms of vaccines. Um, Imagine how difficult it would be to implement maybe some of that. Um, so I think again, there's some risk there because you don't know necessarily how your judge feels about some of these issues. But I think if you talk about national security in particular, I don't think most people are going to say that, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like there is a lot of good debate now about after 9/11, if whether the government went too far, right, in terms of the Patriot Act, in terms of spying on Americans, in terms of the NSA's collecting of information, in terms of the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. Sure. I'll be honest with you. I do think that the judges that you have and the young people, when I talk to Gen Z folks, especially like your first year outs, they have I think are a little bit more open-minded about that debate than it would have been 10, 15 years ago. The bipartisan sort of lines, sorry, the partisan lines, I think were way more defined in 2015 and 2005. But now I think those are more now over issues, I think, about probably Israel and Palestine, and less now about what happened then. So I do think like there could be some national security arguments where, is there an agreed upon, national security threat that if we don't have the flexibility or ability to respond to, would people be upset about that? Sure. Absolutely. So I think mitigating gridlock in that sense, having a flexibility is really important. Having the ability to create administrations or agencies to implement those ideas or task forces are really important. The Peace Corps, right? Remember what I mentioned? The NSA basically can only function now because of executive orders. I think you're going to say is really important. Think about crypto. Think about cybercrime. Those maybe can only be effectively done now because of something like that that is more flexible, more responsive. The argument that I'm talking about the most is protecting social change and state abuse. So the downsides of federalism. And then the one argument that the other one I was talking about before about elections matter, which is like if the people voted and 72 million voted for Biden and 75 or whatever, 6 million, whatever it was, voted for Trump, right? They made an elected decision. And the question is how much resistance or how much red tape should the new party have to go through in order to infect the current party's, the current people's will? And I think you can make an argument that the pro side gives that flexibility in the first 100 days in order to create that vision and take the on economy a different course. And I think under Obama, this is a really cool argument. I think you can make the argument, and under Biden, and under Bush, right? That the first 100 days in office were responding to maybe some economic crises or economic issues, especially Biden, especially Obama in particular, was responding to a recession. And you could talk about how like people elected these individuals to obviously enact a policy change, but also to react to a specific scenario. And if you don't have that ability to do that, they're not representing the will of the people, and that is bad for X amount of reasons. So you could talk about, again, remember I talked about the economy and tariffs on the con side, well, on the pro side, right? The ability to effectively respond to a recession quickly, the ability to send out like stipends without Congress's approval. You can look in something about TARP. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that Congress had to approve in terms of Obama's responses to the recession and the crisis, but there was also flexibility within the Treasury Department and other tools that were outside of the scope of Congress that we couldn't have done in some situations as quickly without the executive orders. So again, flexibility maybe again goes to gridlock in the economy, but elections matter being like first 100 days matters, being able to undo the past matters. The pendulum can swing either way. And if you don't like what's happening under Trump, or if you don't like what happened under Biden, you can be like executive orders allow for continuity of party, not party, but of the people's will, right? So you should allow the president should be able to represent the people that elected him or her, and that's what it's about, and that's what happens under the pro world. I think the best argument on the pro has to be civil rights and federalism having downsides. What I mean by that is, I think there's some really good examples of obviously LGBTQ, desegregation, issues in the past, Jim Crow issues in the past. Everyone knows Brown, but doesn't know all the cases after Brown in terms of implementation of desegregation. It took decades and decades in order to get equal busing, in order to get equal rights in terms of equity past Brown, right? So Brown v. Board of Education obviously set up these principles, but it was only through, the push, not just by Congress, but mostly, not mostly, but also equally from the executive branch that allowed this to happen. And you have some really good examples from different presidents about how states under federalism obviously should be afforded certain rights, right? States should be given the ability to make certain dictates and rules about how their state is run. And if the current president is not the one you voted for, or the past one wasn't the one you voted for, right? You might be thinking, yeah, especially when you are in that other mindset that it's really great to have a state that ends up protecting you. But then the opposite could flip, right? You could be in a state where you disagree with its implementation, but you have a president that agrees with yours. So see that sort of that flip-flop, which is you might have a policy that you agree with that can't be implemented because of a president or because of a state. And what I think that the executive orders allow you to do is social issues, in particular civil rights, tend to, I think, lag a little bit in terms of history. And I think you would talk about how executive orders allow for civil minorities or social minorities in order to have free expression and rights, despite the fact that states won't want them. This gets tricky though, because if I ask you for current examples, they could become partisan really quickly, right? So issues with LGBTQ, right? In terms of back in the marriage cases days where certain states would allow folks to get married, some didn't. Obviously went up to the case of Obergefell. Now, when it comes to trans issues with trans students and sports, that gets pretty partisan really quickly, right? I think there was even a notification during this live stream that the DOJ had sued California for its policies, even though Newsom's changing his policies on it. So that can get tricky. So I do think talking about generally speaking, you can make a list of rights that everyone should agree with, right? The right to vote, hopefully, the right from freedom of discrimination, freedom of expression. You could, I think, just generally talk about all these examples of civil rights being implemented and how states who lag behind those norms cannot do so because of implementation via the president. You might be saying, oh, wait, the legislature should do that, right? But again, what if the legislature, because of the backlash, because of the political capital, can't do it, right? This is a really good study, and I mentioned that there was an example of a specific executive order leading to an X action. So this one specifically looked at an executive order 13684 and found that nearly 20% of the police departments in the study had increases in racial diversity that could be attributed to an executive order, right? So you literally had an executive order passed by Obama, and then 20% of the police departments in that study uh, increase in terms of racial diversity because of that action. So you could talk about how without that sort of push from an executive order, without that sort of push from the executive branch, the legislative branch was too much of a gridlock, too much of a debate. I think you have to talk about how a representative, right, especially where now there's a lot more purple districts, has to have these really big fights and these really big battles and has to get elected every 2 years, right? Every 2 years they have to get elected in the House of Representatives, versus a president has every 4 years. Especially a lame duck president doesn't have to worry about that whatsoever. So if you think about it, a president has a little bit of less political pressure, can take a little bit more political backlash because people's memories are shorter. And a lame duck president in particular has nothing to lose. So I think you could argue that a president is one of the most effective bodies to implement civil rights enforcement because they have the flexibility and less political backlash to do so. So flexibility plus backlash, less backlash, I think is a pretty good argument, talking about how if states resist social change, which hopefully people agree is a good thing, um, that could be an issue. So I think if you remember going back to what we talked at the beginning, finding bigger principles like ending gridlock, protecting social change, state abuse, representation of the people, right? Elections matter. Then having subpoints about those, like protecting civil rights, states' resistance. Remember I talked about with the environment. On the pro side, if states, if one state decides to just like say heck with it, we're not going to implement an environmental policy. Again, you can have litigation, you can do all this stuff, but a short circuit as that's going through, for better or for worse, could be through the president, which I think is going to be a good argument. Same with the economy, same with national security. I didn't put those in here right now. I'll show you some examples here in a second, but I think the national security argument is really important that, you know, in times of emergency, even if we've abused it in the past, right? For every internment camp, Japanese internment camp example, there's probably hopefully some good examples that we've done in the past of what we can implement. I think could be an interesting argument. On the con side, I think it's a little easier, more intuitive, right? Undermining the separation of powers, undermining legislature, states' rights. So federalism on the other side, and then populism and nationalism. It kind of like is the mirror image of the pro side, which is like, oh, like having one president having flexibility and the ability to not face political backlash. That's a good thing. On the bad side of things, it's like presidents are often elected based on more populist nationalist movements, are less representative of like a district, which is very specific to a core group of people, versus a president has to be of the all of the people. So if a big movement takes over, that could be a problem in terms of populism and nationalism, which we'll talk about in a second. So, I mean, there's some pretty good studies on this. There's a really good one by Branham. It's a little old, but again, it kind of does the pre 2005 analysis, I think, pretty good. Some really good quotes, I think, about the president being the law of the land via pen, which is maybe not what the founders wanted. I think the negative side has to be like separation of powers, the scales have tilted too far. And if we don't, again, we're not taking any actions because it's not a policy topic, but if it goes too far, it could end up leading to problems. So I think, like I mentioned, Dressen goes into some really good examples of both Obama and President Trump in terms of maybe where the will of of populism taking control, right? Which is like this idea of outside of the scope of the legislature, enacting very quick, reactive, sort of either xenophobic or what's the word, otherizing sort of legislation really quickly can be problematic, right? And I think a reactive presidency is sort of the theme. It could be Biden, it could be Trump, it could be Obama, which is that a reactive presidency in general, maybe even under FDR, is not a good thing. So FDR was acting quickly for the Japanese internment camps, and you could say like this is giving a rise to populism, which is bad. So the travel ban is a good example when he goes through the legislative through the debates about it. Remember, the travel ban was ended up actually being upheld by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. So the courts did actually review that one and ended up actually agreeing with the presidency on that one. But funny enough, on sanctuary cities, the courts ended up not agreeing with them. I think there's going to be another court case around it coming up because this time it's a little bit different. But this also gets into the other side of states' rights, which is it's actually a really good thing that states sometimes can make their own decisions. Maybe that's the debate, right? And you could argue that, and Trump won, he argued that he was going to take away federal funding for cities that became sanctuary cities, which was basically protective of undocumented migrants. and didn't cooperate with ICE or other law enforcement individuals, and he was going to take away funding. The lower courts, actually, funny enough, held on this specific issue that it was unconstitutional using a different Supreme Court precedent. Would the Supreme Court disagree now? Not so sure. But there's a famous case called the NFIB versus Sebelius. If you look into it, it's actually really interesting. But regardless, they basically said Congress nor the president basically can coerce or condition, mostly Congress in the case of this case, cannot condition anything based on sort of legislation agreement and then coerce states based on that. So again, maybe this is a pro argument because there's a check, right? There's a check on where this may be where states can, sorry, presidents can not go too far. But I think the neg argument's gray area, which is in the short term, the president can break things quickly. And as it's being reviewed by the courts, problems could arise, and that's really bad. And the Supreme Court, in some cases, has been willing to put stays or injunctions on some executive orders, but in some cases, it does not. It does not have a policy. There is a Supreme Court case that's happening and might be decided before Nats about the scope of a district court limiting the president or the legislative branch with a single action. That's something you should be looking into before Nats comes up because that could change some of the topic. Where the Supreme Court might find that there's limits to how far a stay or an injunction can come from a district court. A stay or an injunction basically is the stopping of an action. It could be the court's own actions, it could be the executive branch's actions, it could be an agency's actions. But it basically says, hey, stop doing the thing that you're doing or wait on this thing that you're doing. And the courts have no real principle right now about it. Sometimes they say, hey, keep it going, let it like play out until we've decided. Sometimes they say, nope, hold off on it until we've decided. So I can give you an example. You've probably heard of some of the immigration cases that are happening right now. And a couple of them, they have said, nope, stop deporting specific individuals under a specific law until we've decided this. In some cases, said, nope, you can send folks out. In the Venezuela case, they said, nope, that's fine. Proceed with, uh, removing their access to certain rights or certain privileges they already had. So it's a little inconsistent. So the guess is the Supreme Court's probably going to say that maybe you can still do stays and injunctions, but it only limited to the very specific plaintiffs in your case. What that means is that it's the people that were listed specifically in your case, and unless it's a class um, action suit, which is kind of hard to do, which is a collective group of people, they will not be affected as a whole. So it could be in your district, X amount of people cannot specifically be deported, but that's only applicable to your district. So it's going to be interesting to see what plays out. So. What I mentioned with nationalism, I think the national security argument can go both ways. Post 9/11, I think could be an opposite argument, which is people forget that Executive Order 12333 basically enabled NSA's collection habits. So the ability to indirectly collect Americans' information, but most importantly, information abroad was enabled by an executive order. So for those that don't know, technically speaking, the US government can't collect your specific information or read your information without probable cause, right? But there is this sort of middle area or gray area, which is if you're corresponding with an international person, a non-US citizen abroad, and your information happens to be collected when they are basically having a big dragnet and collecting the information of someone abroad, they are allowed, in some cases, to go through that information. So let's say you're WeChatting your friend in England, and your WeChats are now part of that collection by accident. They weren't looking for it, but it was part of collected on it. There has been some arguments that have been made and defended that now that's something that the Supreme Court, sorry, that the NSA can look through. Some people say it's an abuse. Some people say that led to abuses. Some people said that's actually stopped terrorist attacks. So there's a pretty strong argument on the pro side that there hasn't been an external, arguably an external U.S. There hasn't been an external attack on U.S. ground from an external actor since 9/11, right? There's been some arguments about that. Um, you can go back and forth the San Bernardino shooter in terms of that example, but I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that even have obviously been lone shooters, there have been single incidences, there have been maybe small groups of people, but most of those have been homegrown. What I mean by that is they've been radicalized online. Is pretty good evidence to say that post 9/11, the attacks on U.S. soil from external actors are so low that is because of the flexibility of the U.S. government, of executive orders, of the CIA, of the NSA, something like that. Could go both ways. It could be no, that led to the reviewing of mosques. It allowed to agents being allowed to go into mosques. It could allow the executive orders allowed for the interpretation of the Patriot Act, right? Remember I told you not just gaps of legislation, but interpretation of legislation. There's an example I think later on about Reagan where there was a big debate about how to interpret a law, and the president, through an executive order, could say this word means this when it comes to sort of privacy, et cetera. So I think it can go both ways, but I think it is a good example of, again, if I was to argue about nationalism on the con side, I would say like here are the abuses when it comes to privacy, and it could lead to issues. I mean, you could make the argument. I would be careful of going into the Israel-Palestine debate because I think that surprisingly has been the most polarizing topic I've seen in debate, where even with abortion, even with stuff that typically even, I don't know, capital punishment, which tend to be the ones that we really don't touch in debate, I have found that Israel and Palestine is a little harder. And I think people are the most least likely to be tab on those topics. So I don't know if I would go into those if I were you in terms of strap for the summer, because both on the middle ground, the left of center, the right of center, the left, the right, you really sometimes politics doesn't line, so you really don't know what your judges are thinking. But I have found that people seem to be least tab on that topic right now. So I'm not sure I would use that as in terms of an argument on either side for this topic. But I think outside of that, in terms of national security, in terms of the military, I think privacy issues are probably pretty interesting on both sides. So, wow, I'm still talking. I think I'm gonna, there's like a couple more slides, but I think I'm just gonna. One last thing I want to mention is the administrative state. Remember, I told you post Chevron, it looks like it's harder for us to implement some of the laws. Um, it is seems to be the case that there are some both Democrat and Republicans who want to get rid of sort of the bureaucracy and red tape. On the pro side, you can say that's executive orders allow for that, which is to minimize it. You can say it's a bad thing because now agencies have less experts, they have less control. Now it's only kind of hyper concentrated. But I think that goes to both sides as well. So is it good that there's a heavy administration in terms of expertise and personnel? Is it bad? I think that's another argument that can go both ways. Yeah, I think for now. I'm gonna look at the chat here in a second, but I think to summarize mostly what I've been talking about is like remember what we talked about at the very beginning. This is an evaluative topic that some of you have not debated since 2023. It is at nationals, which is a judging pool that is more diverse, less experienced, um, more of your common person, against teams that oftentimes don't have as much travel experience as some of you might have, or maybe you do. And the norms of the evidence are a little bit different. If you look at nationals in 21, 20, 2017, and even I forgot to mention my year when I went to nationals, after TOC. So I was lucky enough to do well and win TOC in 2010. And then I remember the next term I had was nationals, and I only made it to round 10 or 11. And it was just whiplash, right? And I don't think I adapted correctly, and I don't think I took. And it was funny. It was a democracy topic. It was whether partisanship had basically hurt democracy. And I don't think I took the sort of the adaptation seriously. And it was very meta. It was very evidence oriented, which is good, but not in the big picture. The joke I always make though is that I was working with another team at the time. I think we call them, prep share groups now. And the other team in my prep share group ended up using my cases in finals. They lost, but it's just like, okay, and then I remember watching them in finals being like, they're using my exact same cases and evidence, but implementing it differently because they were thinking much more big picture. Um, and I think that's something where I don't want you to make those same sort of mistakes. So then as we get into the principles, think about what happened in 2021, where you saw, what were the arguments in finals, pro and con, right? It was democratic processes, participation, monopolies, equality. And under those, there's specific subpoints. Under those, there's specific meta studies. So I think that's what I'm kind of getting at on the pro side and the con side is thinking of on the pro side, it's about pro is about flexibility and emergency. It's about protecting social change for minority groups. By definition, right, minorities are in a demographically smaller size group, right? Right, by definition, right? So they have to fight, the famous cards in Nixon that isolate the reasons why minorities have less power and control, right? They have less representation, they're more invisible, they have to face more structural barriers, right? All of those reasons are reasons that minorities have issues. So think about this, right? They have less representation in Congress. They have representation in local businesses and local legislation. So one of the things you could say is that what it allows is allows for a president, right, to give power to minorities when they can't get it from other places and change. So I think talking about how the Civil Rights Act, how post Brown, talking about how LGBTQ issues, Biden issues, it could go swing both ways, right? Because we do know right now of executive orders in both Biden and Trump's presidency that would affect minorities in certain ways. But I think as a whole, holistically, executive orders probably have helped minorities more than they've hurt them. I think there's some pretty good evidence on that. I think that's a pretty good pro argument. Um, Obviously, I remember I talked about practicalities. I think there'd be a good pragmatism argument on the pro side, which is like manning the offices, affecting the offices, being able to man agencies. Like all of this is not described in legislation or Congress's powers in the Constitution really well. So you could not have an effective federal government without executive orders oftentimes. So I think like practicality, civil rights, um, like I said, flexibility, urgency, I think are the pro side. On the con side, it's gridlock, right? Oh, sorry, gridlock's the pro still. Gridlock. Like talk about how much Congress sucks. Congress is slow. Congress is not doing its job. The president is the will of the people. That's the pro side. On the con side, it's like populism, nationalism, reactionism. The tool itself is being used way more than it should be. It's going to be coercing or outside of the scope of the legislative branch. The courts could be a check on it. That's the pro side of the argument. Oh, courts can review them, but they've only been reviewed 150 times. Of those, only 13% have been found to be unconstitutional um, or overturned to some extent. So maybe out of 14,000, that's not a lot. I don't know. I think on the con side, you have a little bit more of an intuitive argument, which is separation of powers. If you're like the the presidency should not be the purse, the war efforts, the economy, and legislation. But now the presidency under Biden and Trump and Obama and Bush have done all those things. Remember, I think what you should do on this topic is memorize at least one executive order, if not two, from the last four presidents on both sides, and then memorize them as good for the pro and memorize them as bad as the con. So you can seem like you're looking at all the presidencies. You're not picking political sides. You sound like you're talking about something you know and you understand. Um, I do think on the con side, again, like appealing to like the concept of like it doesn't matter who's elected president, just know like if the courts aren't checking them, if the legislature can no longer check them, what is left to check them? And then that has to be the pro. And you can be like both Biden and Obama and Trump and Bush use the executive orders in ways that we've never seen before. I think in frequency it's harder to argue. Trump probably in frequency, Biden, Obama, and George Bush in terms of the use as well. But then talk about how maybe now there's a change and the use of this tool now and forever is going to be outweighed by its past benefits. And that means that tool is no longer valuable. So. Okay, I think that's probably enough of me chattering away. Let me open up some of the comments and see what questions we have. Oh my gosh, there's so many comments. Okay, so previous topic debates. So this was a question about NSDA debates. Um, Unfortunately, the NSDA has a couple of them, I think, paywalled behind accounts. So what I mean by that is your coach has to have paid for a resource package to access some of them. Some of them, I think, if you Google them on YouTube, you can find them. I know the NAFTA one especially is available. Um, I will try to see if I can find a workaway around that. But if you have a program that's paid their NSDA dues, I think that would end up happening or helping. If you ask them to log in and go to the resource package and click final debates, you can watch those. Okay. Besides that, I'm not sure. Yes, these slides will be posted. I think I'll post them in the transcript, not the transcript, the sort of the detailed description, and then I'll post them on Discord and Reddit as well. Yeah, so there's a really good question about how do you approach rebuttal? So there's a question from AV Antics being like, hey, what's the best way to approach rebuttal? Because you can't say that civil rights progress is bad or that Japan internment is good. So it's about weighing. And I think this gets to like, if the pro side goes up there and says like, post Brown, you could not have had effective busing of black students in the South without an executive order or without the executive branch basically saying Congress is slow on it and Supreme Court is slow too in terms of enforcement. You're not going to go up there and be like, oh no, that was bad. I think you have to go up there and say, we agree with you that the president has used this tool in the past in order to protect those who are in disenfranchised groups. But then you have to do holistic analysis. And again, it's not a list thing. We can't go up there and be like, here's six times that Biden and Trump did things that hurt minorities. You do need that to some extent. You need that evidence. So you need to say something like, oh, here are some examples of where we think disenfranchised groups were lost. But I think you have to talk about the themes, right? Which is going back to like in the 21st century, populism and nationalism is on the rise. So that if you look at the voters and the constituents who are voting for both for Biden, Obama, Bush, and Trump, you can say as we've gotten partisan over time, that has concentrated power in X ways, concentrated partisanship in X ways, which means the president, if it is a tool of the people, is going to be more reactionary. And we think its current use has been hurting minorities more and is probably in the future going to hurt them more. And here are the reasons as to why. And then you could say, ironically, that the courts now are the protectors of minorities in a lot of ways because they're I would say sometimes the slowest branch. But I think you have to do some sort of holistic analysis, being like, the examples in the past are now starting to be outweighed by the populism and nationalism of the future. But see what I'm doing here? I'm not saying like Trump's Muslim ban alone is a reason to prove that, Trump's Muslim ban outweighs the segregation busing cases. That you have to have examples. And again, have two from each presidency, if you can, and be like, here are good examples of what's happening, or the studies that I talked about. So remember that study from the pro side that said there was a 24% or 20% increase in diversity of police forces after one EO. Find holistic studies that say, after X EO, what happened to, hate crimes in a specific place? Did it go up? Did it go down? And there's some pretty good studies out there. And they have to do that sort of holistic analysis. But I think it's like you have to start as a funnel, as a whole, being like, here's an overarching principle, which is reactionary populism is now being funneled through a tool that does not have a legislative and executive and a constitutional check or a court check. And we think that moving too fast and too quick and it's breaking too many things. So for all the good that it's done in the past, I think it's now what it's doing now in the last 8 years or 12 years is going to be worse than it has in the future. Is one way I would conceptualize it. Like it's really about an overriding principle with examples over outweighing it. And I think if you go and watch the social media nationals topic, it kind of did this, which was like the other side on the con side talked about extremism and talked about violence and had some really good examples of how, January 6 people, well, this was before, I think it was right after January 6, yeah. It was right after January 6 where, they had evidence that they sort of use social media and other groups use social media to commit violence and they used it to radicalize and concentrate, right? And the pro didn't go up there and say, no, that's not true, right? They went up there and said, yes, that is one of the factors. And then they said there were other factors involved as well that help contribute to it. So it's not the only factor. Maybe it's not the most important factor. But then they said the benefits outweigh, right? So this is where the weighing comes in, which is they said, look, for all the extremism and violence we're talking about, everything else that's been going on has been more beneficial for democracy because you've had more people voting, you've had more participation, you've had more activism. And also, this is where it gets tough too, which is you can talk about Wang, you can talk about prerequisites, which is like if the economy is crashing, there's a war that's going on, when you have a president that can declare war unilaterally, that might lead to more civil rights abuses, right? So talking about how a president that has more power can outweigh in the long term the benefits of some presidents that use it to help protect minorities because they use it under, martial law. Well, we've had martial law, but at least recently, um, they can use it to abuse different weighing. So it's not even weighing civil rights versus civil rights. It's weighing the other impacts that we talked about. So if your C2 is privacy rights, it's declaring war. If it's the economy, how does the economy it's hard to go up there and say the economy matters more than civil rights, right? But being like, because of the tanking of economy, civil rights get put on the back burner, and that's bad because of X. So it could be a little bit more weighing. Speech by speech, what is the best way to win a tech inlay? Good question. I I will say that for tech judges, it is about the path of least resistance. And what I mean by that is in some ways, tech judges like to be shown like this sort of like, I don't know, A to B to C point where, oh, you drop the extinction first framing, which makes the round really easy, which means I just have to evaluate what's extinction related. They don't really anything extinction, the round is over. Y'all, that only happens 1 out of 10 times, right? But that's why you guys like it, because it's like a cheat code, right? Which is that 1 out of 10 times the other side will not respond to the extinction first framing. Most of the time, the other 6 times, right? It's no. We also link into extinction. Who links into it faster? Who's more probable? And then the other 3 times is no structural violence or other type of framing comes first for a case, come first, etc. Right? Um, I do think in terms of what ends up winning ballots for me more in summary and final focus is comparative weighing and comparative analysis. What I mean by that is why is my evidence better than yours? So if you get up there and say we have two clashing points about how executive orders affect minorities or how it affects I don't know indigenous tribes, how domestic energy affects indigenous tribes. We have conflicting piece of evidence. The reason you should prefer my evidence is X, right? And you're telling me the reasons as to why, right? I oftentimes say this is the seesaw problem, which is a debate's like a seesaw. It's going up and down, which is it's just up and down, up and down. What I mean by that is like they go up there and say domestic nuclear energy will hurt indigenous tribes. Other side gets up there and says, no, it doesn't. It reduces coal, which hurts them more. I'm like, okay, that's a debate. But then you're not doing the implication. You're not telling me coal hurts them more, which means well, hurts them how? Is it respiratory disease? Is it deaths literally? If that outweighs the leaching of uranium into waters, right? There's not really, you have to do some comparison. But more importantly, then you know what happens in the back half? The other side just come up there and says, no, the, uranium leaching is real and it's hurting them a lot. And the other side says, no, coal is killing them. And there's no comparison. It just goes back and forth, back and forth. And the back half of the debate, there's no change. So I think that's the biggest problem I see with tech rounds is that in the back half, you have to do comparative analysis. My evidence is better. What's the implication? I don't like docbotting, which is you go up there and read a block file and you just read the full responses. You need to tether responses to the other side. So you need to take, like, if you go up there and they have civil rights, like we have 5 responses to the civil rights argument on the pro, and you just read through a block file. Well, implicate each response. Like our first response is, uh, like okay, let's say they're running civil rights in the pro. It's like second on the con, no. Populism hurts civil rights more for 5 reasons. First, a holistic study from Harvard Law Review found that hate crimes increased after executive order 5264, and then he moved on. What? There's no implication. Why do Are hate crimes the most important metric? Why is your evidence better? Why is it more holistic? Right? You have to implicate that. If you don't talk about the other side's arguments outside of their tags, you have not done implication, right? If you don't talk about what they said outside of their tags, you're just a talk about it. So I think that's really important. I mean, weighing is the most obvious thing, but if you become a good debater, better debater, you end up getting some more weighing. But I'll have more about that if you come to camp. For lay judges, I do think it's what I talked about, which is big picture, the Hail Mary that I talked about, which is, pro, con for tech judges, clash, weighing, comparative analysis, declarative language. You can't vote for them. They've dropped this argument at that point. The only thing you can vote for is here. Anything else is intervention. On the lay side of things, right? It's very different because it can just be vibes, right? So it's coming up with one-liners, being like, vote pro in order to have a government that's for the people, responsive for the people, and it can act for the people in times of crisis and emergency, right? Saying something like that, I think, is really important. But, even like a joke at nationals is something funny, everyone can agree the 3 things they don't like, right? Stepping in puddles, waking up early, and Congress, like whatever the funny joke, that's some Seinfeld joke about that. But finding things that you can correspond with lay judges as a whole is fine, but that's not enough, right? I think the best way to go about it is not just axioms and jokes and one-liners, it's vibes. What I mean by vibes is that last 30 seconds in summary and final focus being like, look, this debate can get really messy, but as a whole, our principles about the separation of powers are fundamentally flawed. But more importantly, remember, we have the best evidence in the round. The Harvard Law Review evidence is the best piece of evidence that looks at 150 cases over time. If anything, you know that if you vote for us, our evidence backs up our points. I don't know. Lay judges vote for that all the time. I've had, once a tournament, I have a ballot that I see or a panel I'm on where a lay judge votes for a cross, right? So you never know what they're going to vote for. But if you talk about meta issues, what I mean by that is um, you talk about an issue in the round that's not an argument reason. Like, why are you winning from a non-argumentative reason? What I mean by that is evidence, like impacts. But I'm not talking about the impacts. Like, our impacts are bigger, kind of. But I think that's what I call a meta or vibe related issue. Is that you'd be surprised how oftentimes debaters win for something like that in the round. Why do I think AF is harder to win? I think it goes back to this kind of irony because technically F is the status quo. What I mean by that is like if it were true that we think that executive orders do more harm than good, right? Uh, they're still around. So that means either constitutionally, practically, legally, we have not collectively had enough like bipartisan support to say, hey, we don't like them. So it should be like pro should be the status quo. It should be like the better side of the topic because we haven't gotten rid of it. But my inkling is the average American does not know that much about executive orders. And when they do, it's because they're bad. As in, what I mean by bad is not like politically bad, but they're like usually really big actions that they disagree with in their own personal politics. So like example, the internment camps or the travel ban or DACA, right, which is the Dreamers uh, implementation, like when people know of them, they think it's something, they often think it's like the ones that exist outside of the control of the federal government outside of the president's control. So, like, if you ask your parents today, like, what do they think of executive orders? I'm guessing that they're not a fan of them because the majority of the ones they probably think of are not the practical ones that are like have implemented agencies and allow them to function. They're not ones about legislative intent. They're about the big issues that Congress will not pass because it's so difficult and it's so politically liable to do so. But because a presidency only has 4 year, has only it's a 4 year term or is a lame duck, they don't have to worry about that. They do some bigger things. I think presidents actually take bigger actions than Congress does at this point. Um, so that's why I think pro is harder. I also think this isn't political, in my opinion. Statistically speaking, Trump's orders have been more challenged in courts. If you look at the Drazen study, looking at the orders, he said something like, I don't know, 4 or 5 of Obama's executive orders were challenged. One, I think, was paused or something like that. Maybe it was more challenged, but I think it was only 1 or 2 that were paused or even overturned. Versus Trump's, I think, rates of especially Trump too, of court injunctions or stays or suits is something ridiculously higher. And by the way, these are judges appointed by Trump, George Bush, Reagan, um, that are sometimes finding his orders to be so suspect that they put them on hold. Again, just let the process play out. So I do think like Trump too is different because he's lame duck. And I do think the people around him are different. Where before, I think in Trump one, he brought in people that were, I would say, a little bit more center right. And again, this isn't again saying one's better than the other. I'm just telling you, like, I think he's bringing in people that he knows will enact his legislation and his vision, knowing that he doesn't have a second term. I mean, a third term, right? Biden, maybe he thought he was going to get another one, or Kamala would take over. So he wanted to be more sensitive. I don't think Trump at this point really cares if his vice president takes over. Um, so that's going to be a part of it as well, in my opinion. That I think just non-politically speaking, I think executive orders are unpopular right now. I think under Biden and Trump. So I think that's why the pro is harder. K's in theory at Nats. I would say I didn't judge any of it last year. I didn't judge it the last time I saw it. So I would say very low chance. I just think statistically, your chances of getting a double tech panel are 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 5. No, yeah. I'm trying to think if I wasn't on any, I was on one last year. Um, I think that's the one in prelims, yeah. A very low chance. So, which means that the K's especially no. Theory definitely not. Probably not likely. If you have a lay and tech on the same panel, how do I guarantee a TO? Yeah, that's a good question. Um, Wait, before I think about train of thought, I think the pro is harder because I think executive orders are more unpopular under Biden and Trump, which means I think you have to memorize good executive orders from Obama and Bush, is my opinion, by the way, and then use those in the pro side. Like, hey, it's good, that what Obama and Bush did. And I think civil rights in like the 60s being like states resisted segregation, desegregation as much as they could, and the courts were really slow on it, and Congress was really slow on it. So you know what happened? Executive orders, executive branch came in. Um, how do I get a lay in a tech? Remember, if you adapt to the lay, the tech judge has to vote on the round the way it's implemented, right? So if I see a round that's happening that's a lay round, I'm going to be obviously frustrated because it's not line by line. It's not line by line. There's not a lot of wang. but I'm still going to vote for an argument. I'm not going to be like, I voted for you because you have better evidence or you sounded better. I'm going to be like, okay, your sound was slower, but I'm still going to vote for you. You proved to me that the amount of civil rights abuses because of populism and nationalism probably outweigh some examples that we had in the 20th century. And the trend seems to be now that populism and nationalism is higher. So the likelihood of executive orders harming minorities is probably going to be higher. So I think that outweighs the con. So I'm still going to vote for you, even if it's more simple, right? Versus in a tech round, if you go up there and say executive orders are really bad because it gives the presidency too much power of the economy, and that's right now decking the world economy, which is going to put a billion people into poverty because we've allowed the president now to conduct tariffs without approval from Congress. And the world economy affects more people, puts 900 million people into poverty. That outweighs any other impact. Right. Like obviously that from a tech perspective, I'm going to be very specific. Like scope, in terms of how many people are affected, poverty, leads to cyclical poverty, which can then lead to obviously mortality rates increasing. But in a lay round, you're not going to say things like that, right? You might do the tariff argument being like, it's going to deck the economy, it's going to hurt the world economy, but your focus is going to be like, a president should not hurt the wallet of every American on their own whim without a congressional consensus, because it's important that if your egg prices, your iPhone prices, your PS5 prices are going up, that at least the Americans all agree that should go up or down. It should not be on the whim of an individual. That's very different than 900 million people going to poverty, right? So I think that's kind of the difference between the two of those. So how do you win? How do you win then? I think it's you should always. I also have, and this is very controversial. I think flays are harder to judge with or to be judged by than lays, because it's they're taking notes and they're listening to arguments, but then it's just random in terms of what they do. What I mean by that is they'll vote on a contention and say, I voted on this, but it's like a contention you didn't bring up later on, or they ignored or blocked to or response to. So they're flowing some parts and not the others. So it's like how you deal with that, I don't know. Versus a lay judge, you can sound better. You can be more persuasive in terms of you had more axioms, you didn't stutter, you had more eye contact. I know that sounds so bad, but like that's going to be part of what you're going to have to be able to do, and you should be practicing. You should practice your speech in front of a camera before you go to Nats, and you should listen to yourself and see what tics you have. You should give a speech in front of your parents and see what they say and see if they understand it. Like I did this all the time with my parents, so I'd be like, hey. I'm going to give you my first contention. What do you think about it? What didn't make sense to you? You should be doing those drills. Like, you know how you do drills with your coach or your partners or your debate team in terms of tech, right? You do red team drills where I read a contention, then you read the best responses and you implicate them. Or you do a funnel drill, which is you read five responses, then read them smaller and smaller in terms of word economy. That's great. Do that for tech as well. But then for lay, elevator speech, be able to explain the argument to your parents. Doing something like that, I think, is going to help you. If you look at the team that won last year, Durham Academy, I think is a great example of a really, 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 really good team on the tech, but an amazing team on the flay and the lay. And I think that's the team that's going to be a team like that is going to be able to win finals as well as other rounds. Is the one who can appeal to the most common judge, which is going to be lay judges at nationals. Okay, I think that is it. Okay. Any other questions in the chat? Well, hopefully this was useful. I know, there wasn't necessarily a full explanation of all my contentions or ideas, but hopefully that gets you started because I also think I have this sort of thesis that in coaching that the best teams are the ones that cut their own cards and read their own cards. So I have found that teams that just take cards off the wiki, don't read them, don't understand them, I think do less well. So I think you doing out there going or cutting the cards is going to be really useful for you. But I'll post the slides from this um, presentation on the description and in Discord so that you can take a look at them. You can obviously use any of the cards that I have implemented or put in there. But hopefully this was useful for everyone as we go through. Cool. I see someone else asked about this, but I think that covers everything. Any last minute questions before we wrap up? Ooh, 2 hours. Wow, who knew? Okay. Well, thanks everybody. I will be judging it at, so hopefully I get to judge you guys. And if you ask, obviously, I'm not allowed to give feedback, unfortunately, at the tournament. It's a closed tournament, by the way. Another thing you should know. But please come, feel free to talk to me after the tournament, the prelim rounds. I can give you some feedback, hopefully, on rounds, and hopefully, I'll see you at Philadelphia. So good luck, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the year.